What's up, everybody? Today on Universal Theory, we're going to be talking about electromagnetism, and we're going to talk about gender and rhythm will be the two principles. We hope you like this new format. Let us know in the comments down below if this is something you're enjoying, if you're able to get more out of it because you're able to just listen to it on the way to the grocery store or when you wake up. That's why we're trying to make this information more compact, more bite-sized for you, the viewers at home that are watching this, and giving you that information because we know we all are busy. So let's get right into it. We're going to talk about electromagnetism, and I'm just going to talk a bit about it. I know if you follow our podcast, then you know that this is something we've covered before, but essentially electromagnetism is something that still exists, but it's kind of evolved. And we have something called quantum electrodynamics now. There's a lot of these quantums moving around in the world of science these days as we understand things. So the classical application is still fine. It's still usable. The math still all works. It's still a very sound science. And there's a lot of great analogies there. So that's why we're going to cover that. And quantum electrodynamics we covered in the light episode, and we touched on it in the fine structure episode. So if you want more in-depth content about the quantum electrodynamics, go check those out. I'll do my best to remember to link those in the video above. But electromagnetism, they are two fields like we talked about in quantum field theory. This kind of ties back to that. And it's the photon, what we originally thought in this classical sense. The photon is moving, the energy is moving between this electric and magnetic field. It kind of is oscillating back and forth between these fields. And we can see the rhythm in that. We can see the rhythm in how this energy is oscillating back and forth between these two fields. And then it moves perpendicular. So imagine the energy moving kind of like this, and then the motion of the photon is coming towards you. So that's how the photon propagates through space.
Yeah, it's perfect too the way that we say propagate. Kind of like generation.
Yeah.
We're propagating something. So it's being created.
Yeah.
And we're talking about gender, and then it's being propagated through the electric, masculine, and magnetic, feminine fields.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fact that it's oscillating between the two, which once again is rhythm.
Yep.
And then even in the male and female, pair bonding or propagating, interacting with each other on a sexual level, you have sperm and ova.
Yep.
And then the rhythm of the act itself, and how the light is the child, and it's being produced by this rhythmic oscillation between the two fields.
Yeah. And that's exactly. The child is the light. And that's a great analogy of understanding what's happening here. Magnetism in itself, it has its own poles, right? You've got positive and negative. So I think we all kind of understand what's happening with a magnet. What's interesting about a magnet is when you break a magnet in half, you don't end up with a positive side and a negative side. The structure of the magnet reorganizes itself to now have two positive, a positive and a negative, and a positive and a negative. So now we have two magnets. And then if you break them in half again, now you have four magnets, so on and so forth. And that's the beauty of magnetism. And we've never found a monopole. I had a professor in undergrad where that was his life's research, was to try to find the monopole. And he told me that he was no longer looking for it. That, hey, I've created some great technology, but I am no longer looking for this monopole. That's how strong kind of this duality, this kind of polarity between these two poles is, even though that's, one of the principles we could tie in here is the polarity of magnetism. But then when we think about, okay, that's one aspect of the electromagnetic spectrum. Well, what's happening with this electromagnetic spectrum? Well, that's how we navigate. That's how we get our information. So that information, the information is moving through space on these photons into our eyes. So the photons themselves are masculine, acting on our eyes, which are feminine. And then our body is consuming that information. And then you have photons that are going to hit the body and they're going to be absorbed through the body. So the body's feminine, but then the body becomes masculine and we radiate. We talked about that in the light episode as well. And it's good to reiterate on these concepts because we're trying to build a bridge between what we know and what we understand in this foreign language of science. So in building this bridge, it's just good to reiterate on these topics. So the body is radiating these photons, but not at the same intensity that we absorb them at. We absorb them kind of at an ultraviolet level. So as we talked about on the light spectrum, it's above violet, but we emit them down in the in the infrared. So all the way down on the other side. And it's about 1/20th of the photon on average. The photons that the body absorbed, what we emit is about 1/20th of the energy.
Exactly. Yeah, which goes into entropy, which is a rhythmic process of what we would say masculine and feminine, and it has low entropy to high entropy, useful energy to less useful energy, less components, less possible combinations, more components, more possible combinations. And then life happens in this happy medium between the two.
Yeah.
Which once again goes back to, the coupling of the two to create this harmony of rhythm, this equilibrium, which is the child, just like light in the electromagnetic fields. And then also going back to what you said about when you break a magnet down, and you don't just get a positive and a negative, you get a positive and a negative per breakdown. And that's why we can't find a monopole, is because polarity is a principle as well as gender, because the opposite ends of each polarity is considered masculine and feminine, but technically the masculine is feminine and the feminine is masculine because it's on a spectrum.
Yeah, and we can see that through the magnetic lines. If you were to see a 3D version of a magnet in its electric field, you would see lines coming out of the positive, wrapping around, and that same line is going into the negative. So they are connected in their fields. It's not something we perceive unless there's something in the presence of that field, because we just don't see the magnetic field. But there's something to that. And that's how we can apply this principle of gender and know that, hey, positive and negative, and these two things are connected. There's another great analogy of science and metaphysics coming together, and us not only building this bridge. There's this whole idea of building, of understanding, and the whole reason why we want to know what's happening in science is because it's a foreign language. What's happening around us is something that we have to label and understand what's happening. It's the same reason why we talk. It's the same reason that we communicate. We're trying to build a bridge to that alien language. Same thing with metaphysics. We're building a bridge to that alien language. And now we're building a bridge between these two alien languages.
Yes. And, why would we want to alienate ourselves from one aspect of the spectrum?
Right.
So it's like, metaphysicians, they have a very unique perception of the universe, and so do scientists and physicists and mathematicians and anyone that's kind of like in that left hemispheric realm where they're breaking things down into parts, and the metaphysician is unifying things into wholes. And you have some metaphysicians who do this more or less accurately. You have some physicists and mathematicians and so forth and scientists that do this more or less accurately, but we're trying to build a harmonious bridge of the masculine and the feminine, the masculine within the feminine, feminine in the masculine, feminine in the masculine, masculine in the feminine. We're trying to unify these two polarities into a single whole because they're not actually divisible.
Yeah, because what's the other side of science? You could say philosophy, because that's where it started. I'm not making any kind of grand postulation I'm not like hypothesizing. I'm not assuming anything, if those words work better for you, because that's where science came from. Science came from philosophy. When people think of religion, they start to get dogmatic. They start to think of the negative. Same thing with science. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the essence of the thing. The essence of philosophy is science. The essence of science is philosophy. We have minds that can see one or the other. And I recommended the Lex Friedman, Stephen Wolfram. You could go check that out if you haven't already checked that out. But he admits, he's a very left-brain thinker, and he admits that he had to leave the concept alone. And then after he's developed this and all this understanding, he can come back to these concepts about mysticism, about esoteric knowledge, and start to apply them to his understanding of science. It doesn't get any rawer than that. This guy is an absolute genius. He created Wolfram Alpha. He graduated college as like a kid. He has just been doing stellar things since the 70s.
Yeah, he's very brilliant. And like Trent said before, he is expressing these ideas, from 30 years of research.
Yeah.
And adept research. He's not someone who just loosely talks about subjects. He's very thorough in his analysis. And he's saying things that are concentrating these metaphysical concepts. And me and Trent, we have been saying a lot of these things. Like when I seen his lecture, I was like, wow, this guy's saying stuff that we've been saying. And he's putting terms to what we were saying, because we were we didn't really know what the terms were, because we kind of thought like we were inventing them at the time. And we kind of were, because we were at like, the forefront of this. But, once again, we're not bragging. It's the fact that it's time for these concepts to come to fruition. If you have a scientist who only focuses on the research that's already been done, then he's only replicating other people's research, and he's only going to get so far. You need people to come in with novel ideas. You need an Einstein. You need a Nikola Tesla. You need, all these other great physicists that were theoretical physicists that came up with these concepts that these other guys ran with, basically. So that is essentially what he was saying about philosophy having science within it, and science having philosophy within it, and them being on a spectrum. Philosophy equals philosophy, science equals science, but they're the same thing.